Good afternoon. I'm Richard Brooks. I'm a journalist with Private Eye magazine, which is the magazine up on your screen there. And this is what it looks like in real life. Our online presence traditionally has been just about saying go out and buy the magazine. But we've ventured out a little bit, and I'm going to explain to you how we've used the power of the internet to learn a lot about how offshore companies are buying up England and Wales. I'll demonstrate the work we've done in a minute, and then CHIDO, DUNN from Global Witness, will give you the lowdown on exactly how and why money laundering through the UK is so popular, and particularly through UK properties. Before I do, I'll just say that there are lots of reasons why offshore companies buy up so much land and property in England and Wales. And it's not all money laundering, it's perhaps not even mostly money laundering. There are huge tax advantages to buying land through an offshore company. Whatever George Osborne says about how he's clamped down on it, there are still big breaks for commercial investors who can buy and sell UK property using offshore companies and make their gains tax-free. There are also big advantages for those commercial companies in terms of income tax or corporate tax on income by using an offshore company when they rent out property. There are big stamp duty advantages as well, both for individuals and businesses. And the offshore company is also a particularly useful structure for rich individuals to use for inheritance tax planning, to put a property into an offshore wrapper and to put that in a trust and then pass it on to their little darlings tax-free for generations to come. But I guess most people here, most law enforcers here anyway, are interested in the money laundering angle. We heard from the offshore, the OCCRP reporting people, Drew and Paul, this morning, about how popular the UK and London is for dirty money coming out of Eastern Europe in particular. There was a report recently by Transparency International which looked at, part of it looked at investigations by the British Police's proceeds of, the Metropolitan Police's proceeds of corruption unit, and found that 75% of the properties they identified as assets of criminals and money launderers in London were owned through offshore companies. There's another report out today, another Transparency International report. I don't mean to plug CHIDO's competitors too much, but there's another report this morning showing that the estate agents who are selling offshore properties to oligarchs, other wealthy people buying up London, reported only 179 suspicious transactions. Now, the data we've found shows that was in 2013-14. We found that in 2013 there were 11,000 properties bought through offshore companies. So it gives you an idea of the scale of the issue and just how minimal the response is, how low the awareness is of the problem among the professionals. I guess you wouldn't expect too much more of estate agents, but there's not much more awareness among other representative bodies, other law enforcers like HMRC who police the money laundering regulations. So what, at Private Eye, we've been looking at money laundering as an issue for several years now, and it was clear from the cases we'd seen that property and offshore shell companies was a major route, particularly in London. So we decided to try to find out just what the scale of the problem was. and to identify which properties were being held in this way. The Land Registry is the government body that keeps a record of who owns what property in the UK. And sorry about this. Sorry. And it does have a public website. You can go to that website and you can look up the address of a property and find out who owns it. But that's only any good if you know which property you're looking at in the first place. You can't search by owner, and you have to know the precise address. So what we did was, through a series of Freedom of Information requests, I and a colleague, Christian Eriksson, who's here also, established just which properties between 2005 and 2014 had been bought by offshore companies. And this is the list. I think it's the first time we've revealed it in public. But as you can see, there are lots of them. You just flick through, huge values. There you've got multiple properties of £7 million each. Those are in, you can tell just from looking at that page that the most popular territory to use is British Virgin Islands. The most popular location for buying property through this kind of structure is in London. And if we scroll right the way down, we see that there are, in that period alone, we found over 100,000 properties. The most common, the most popular areas we decided then to look at really were the richest boroughs in London, and I've just got to find that. With an estate agent, a company called Home, a Notting Hill estate agent, we analysed the London boroughs and what the purchases were in one particular year, or in a couple of years, in City of Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea. They're the prime areas, super prime in many cases. And this is what we found. You can see that just in these years alone, the percentage of transactions going through offshore companies is pretty substantial. This is residential property, by the way. You can see that in the City of Westminster in 2012, the 20% of transactions were bought through offshore companies, and that represented 32% of the value, which indicates that these are the more expensive properties, even in somewhere like the City of Westminster. You go to other areas, or you go more specifically, look more narrowly at particular areas, and you find in some of those an extraordinary proportion goes through offshore companies, and they're probably where you expect. In 2014, in 2012, in the Boltons, which is an upmarket area in Knightsbridge, 50% of sales were through offshore companies. Similarly, in Knightsbridge, Queen's Gate, which is a nice road that connects Knightsbridge and Kensington, 50% again. So in some areas you're getting half the property, and in some areas by value even more than half of the property being bought by offshore companies, which is all very interesting. But where are they, and how do you find them? We, using the information we got from the Land Registry through Freedom of Information requests, I keep saying through Freedom of Information requests because this government is threatening to limit the availability of freedom of information law, particularly to journalists, and we wouldn't have been able to do to do this project without that law. So, I need to keep plugging it to show how important it is, because this information wouldn't have come out through the government alone. But using that and some other information we got about the coordinates of the property, we were able to map all these properties. And if you go on our website, which is if you just search private eye and map, you can find this. You can buy our Christmas cards as well while you're there. Still time, they're very good. If we've got a moment at the end, we'll advertise it even more. But on this map, you find a searchable. This is an interactive map which allows you to look at any area you want. I'll just put it up full screen. If we zoom in on London, I'll show you one or two that takes a bit of playing around with. That big gap in the middle, that's Hyde Park. Nobody actually lives in Hyde Park, or at least no one who's got an offshore company. But at the bottom, you'll see this place. This is a good example. Bowater House, which has been renamed. It's now called One Hyde Park, and this is owned by the freehold of it. I should say, just to explain the map, the orange areas are the actual geographic outlines of freehold properties. So that's One Hyde Park, the freehold property. Within there are all the leasehold interests in that property, and they're not precise geographic. They don't show the boundaries of the flats, for example. There's one's on top of the other. But those purple dots are all the flats within there. And look, Bowater House, now One Hyde Park, was acquired by Project Grange Limited, which is the Candy Brothers company, in 2006 for £480 million. If you look at all these dots here, these are all the flats. You see the flat, just about all of them are BVI companies. That's quite a cheap one, actually, 9.8 million. Must have got in early. I think as you get... No, hang on, we're back on there. Let me find it. 23, getting a bit more expensive. 10 million. 57 million, that's a pretty tasty, or maybe even tasteless one. You need to play around with it. It does work very well, I promise you. I'm trying to get this. Yeah, they're 57. So there you get the name of the company, Elmore Holdings Corp. It's in the British Virgin Islands, bought in 2011, which is when the building opened for sales. And it cost 57 million. Now this map enables you to look up a particular area that you're interested in and find out which companies there are. Now, I don't know who's behind Elmore Holdings Corp. I guess that's the whole point. But you may have intelligence that may know somebody who does. So this map I hope, will be a great resource for investigators to use. Not least because you'll see there's a little button that says Get in Touch, a little tab. And if you click on Get in Touch, you can send us an email to tell us all you know about it. And we'll be very grateful. It's not just, let's just, as you pan out, you can see just how much of the rest of the expensive areas of London have been bought up by offshore companies. We're now looking in those areas, you're looking at Kensington, Belgravia, some of you may know these parts, and north of Hyde Park, you're going into the Paddington type area. Then you go further over, there's Regent's Park. Regent's Park is a particularly rich area. A lot of those places being sold off. A lot of property in the Regent's Park area and some in Kensington is owned, or the freehold is owned, by a body called the Crown Estates, which is, well, they don't like you calling it the Queen's Property Company, but that's what it is really. The Queen is the legal owner to a lot of freehold properties around Regent's Park and Kensington. The income from that estate goes to the Treasury, and the Queen gets 25% to sort of pocket money, really, or to replace the civil list payments, to put it in its correct political terms. But that group, the Crown Estates, has over recent years has been selling off a huge number of properties to some very rich foreigners through tax haven companies. A lot of them to oligarchs, a lot of them around the edge of Regent's Park. And from what we know about, just how keen estate agents are to alert the authorities to what's going on, it does seem a slightly controversial use of, what's essentially was public land. It's not just London. I mean, everybody's familiar now with London with oligarchs buying up Kensington and places like that. But if you go out into the countryside, you'll see one area you may have heard of is Henley. And look at that. It's a very small town, Henley, but there's a huge amount of property owned offshore. There's the river. You can see the River Thames sort of snaking its way past Henley. This area, Cullen Court, 32 million. Up here, Hambledon Estating. I don't know if you've heard of a village called Hambledon. It is the quintessential English chocolate box village. It's used as film location for things like Midsummer Murders. Anywhere where you want, a sort of English murder mystery at the cricket club when everyone meets for tea in the tea shop afterwards, that kind of thing. That's the village, and that is owned by a Swiss financier through a British Virgin Islands company. Down here, his neighbour, not far away, look at that one, that's Park Place, Remedham. That, at the time, I think was the most expensive single property, residential property bought in the UK, 120 million, by, who was it? The Russian banker who is still wanted in Moscow, former president of the Bank of Moscow. He bought Park Place, which is a very, actually I'll just show you a picture of Park Place to see what, if you want to see a little slice of the British Virgin Islands on the River Thames. That's it. This is a kind of, that's what you get for 120 million of BVI money out of Russia. Anyway, that gives you an idea. Those are the kind of places you can look for. You could search in here. If you go on here, you just search an area. Often it's a good idea to search a street. So let me look. If I, let's say one, Fillmore Gardens, which I think is where Saddam Hussein's former arms dealer has a house. It takes you to that area, and you can see that's in Kensington. So if you think you know someone, if you suspect or know of somebody who is said to have a place in a particular area, a particular square of London, you're not quite sure where it might be, or you want to start, you want somewhere to start looking, this is a good way to do it. You can find a place, you can maybe go and knock on the door. So I hope that's a good source of information. Anyway, with that, I'll hand you over to CHIDO. Take that.
My name is CHIDO DUNN, and I work for Global Witness. For those of you who aren't familiar with what we do, we're a not-for-profit who work to try and break the links between corruption, conflict, and natural resource exploitation. We're most famous for our work on blood diamonds, but more recently we've been working on property issues. Richard's done a great job of setting the scene for the extent of the problem, the scale of it, and some of the reasons for it. And I'm going to talk you through one of our investigations just to explain a bit about how you actually begin to start digging behind some of these offshore companies once you've identified a red flag and identified a property. So I'm leading our investigation into whether the UK is providing a safe haven for corrupt individuals and their assets. Our primary focus has been on property. The work is a result of almost 2 decades of looking at these natural resources deals and realizing that in order to facilitate corruption, you need a bank account, you need a bank willing to take your money. You need an offshore company, we call them anonymous companies, so any offshore company where it's basically impossible to figure out who really sits behind it. And generally, once you've acquired your money, you want to buy yourself a property, so a Georgian mansion in Mayfair, a penthouse in New York, a vineyard in the south of France. Property is an excellent way to launder money. You can drop a large amount at one time with very few questions asked, especially in the UK. And the value of that asset will gradually increase. In the course of our research, which has been going for about 2 years now, we've identified 3,000 of London's most expensive properties. And we've really started to try and dig behind who owns them and where the money came from. Now, as you can imagine, this is a very difficult and laborious process. It takes a lot of time and resources and expertise. But we've begun to identify a series of case studies, and I'm going to take you through one of them now. In July of this year, we published a report called Mystery on Baker Street. It revealed that £147 million of property, mostly around London's Baker Street, is owned by a collection of anonymous companies. Now, we don't know exactly who the real person is behind those companies, but we were able to identify a number of ties between the companies, the people that manage them, and Rakat Aliyev. Aliyev was the son-in-law of President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan. He spent a number of years acting as the head of the Kazakh secret police and tax police, and he also served as ambassador for a while. During this time, he amassed a vast business empire and fortune. He was also accused of murder, money laundering, and torture. Unfortunately, he died before his cases could go to trial. He was in his jail cell in Austria awaiting trial for murder at the time he committed suicide. The investigation that we undertook into Aliyev and the properties we'd identified was incredibly complex. And I don't want to bore you with too much detail because I'm aware that I'm the last thing standing between you and cocktails, so I will just be brief. We identified that there were 2 different collections of properties. One was £137 million of freehold and leasehold property in Baker Street, and one was a mansion in Highgate. These properties were purchased over the course of 2 years by 4 different UK companies. 3 of those companies were new companies, so were probably incorporated for the purposes of buying the property, and one was a pre-existing company. 3 out of 4 of the companies were subsidiaries of the same BVI company at the top of the chain. The other one, although it wasn't a subsidiary, it said in its company accounts that it considered the BVI company to be its parent. To make things even more difficult, the BVI company at the top of the chain changed year after year. There was no apparent reason for this change. The company name would change but would be almost the same. So it meant tracing the ownership structure over a number of years very difficult to trace. We spent months unraveling it, and even then we were left with a lot of unanswered questions. However, what we could see was that the managers of these companies could all be linked to Aliyev or companies known to be owned by him in some way. Really, it was just a matter of looking at the company registries around the world, buying the company documents and starting to piece together names and dates and to see patterns emerging. We could also see that there were a number of links between people and companies, and also that at the time the transactions were going through, it was the same time that he was being investigated in the EU for money laundering. So it would have been a really useful time to put a large amount of money into property as opposed to trying to go through a bank. Now, all the companies and the people involved deny that Aliyev is or ever was the beneficial owner of the companies or the owner of the properties. But they've refused to identify the owner, all citing reasons of confidentiality. So even though we knew what we were looking for, and even though we had the resources to do the investigation, it was still extremely difficult for us to actually point to one particular, silver bullet and say this proves fundamentally that he was involved and that the source of the funds was not legitimate. And if it's difficult for people like us to do this, can you imagine what it's like for your tax inspector in Tanzania or your journalists in the Ukraine who have potentially more limited resources than we have limited time, and are also under security threats a lot of the time? So what we've been calling for on the back of our report and other reports we've published on this topic is transparency in the property market in London. If we achieve this, we think the type of painstaking investigations that we've been undertaking will be easier. And it means that if people like us and the police can trace an asset that belongs to a corrupt politician, it'll be easier to seize that asset, sell it, and give the money back to the people from whom it was stolen. And that's really the point of all of this. This money is money that should be going towards education and healthcare, and it's not. It's being pumped into mansions, and the people who steal it are living these lives of excess and luxury, while the people they're supposed to be serving and protecting are suffering back at home. And it's not just an issue for the people who've been stolen from. You've had the head of the FBI and the National Crime Agency here say it's a national security issue. It's also an issue for your taxpayer. I mean, if you think about the amount of aid that's being sent by the UK to places like Nigeria, and then you look at the amount of money that's coming out and being pumped into the property market, you can really see that there's a discrepancy there, and it's really something that needs to be stopped. There's also an effect on your average everyday Londoner in relation to house prices. The head of the UK's National Crime Agency said back in July that he believes that the London property market has been skewed by laundered money. He said that prices are being artificially driven up by overseas criminals. And all of this works within a general theme. The UK's Prime Minister has been pushing us all further towards transparency. Back in 2013, the G8 states got together and agreed that they would do more to end or take on anonymous company ownership. And this resulted in the UK promising, and now it's about to affect sort of one of the first registers of company ownership. So in the UK from July, you'll be able to search a company name and it'll tell you who the beneficial owner is. So following on from this work, the Prime Minister, as a result of our report and the work of other anti-corruption campaigners like Transparency International, announced that the UK government would start to look into London property and do the same thing, try and figure out how it can stop dirty money from entering. He said in his speech, corruption is the greatest enemy of our time, that properties are being bought up using offshore companies, and there's no place for dirty money in Britain. And that's where he specifically committed to really looking at this issue and figuring out how do you get a transparent property market? How do you take the website that Richard's shown you and actually identify who the real people are? We welcome and applaud the Prime Minister's approach and the fact that he's agreed to take this on. However, the consultations were announced 5 months ago, and as yet they have not started. So we won't be applauding it too much until we actually see the government starting to take concrete steps to actually deal with the problem. There's a slight discord between rhetoric and reality at the moment. And then there's another problem. I mean, say you get this register on foot. How do you actually keep it up to date and accurate? How do you enforce it? I mean, the police are already completely overstretched. They have more investigations than they know what to do with. So there's going to be a bit of thinking that has to be done around who's going to be obliged to give the information, what are the penalties going to be if they fail to do so. And we're working with the government at the moment to try and help them design that legislation that can actually be fit for purpose. Now, finally, it's worth noting that this isn't a problem just in London. Other governments, including the US, Australia, France, are all allowing dirty money to enter their property markets. Indeed, the coverage of our work so far has been incredible. It's been covered by national press in Mexico, Brazil, India, China. It's clear that the issue of dirty money entering property markets is a problem for everyone and something that everyone's interested in. So the question for us remains, even if the UK government does exactly what we're asking them to and closes down every single loophole, what's to stop your corrupt politician from just running off to Sydney or Miami or Geneva to buy a property? So we're really thinking about how to take the momentum that's building in the UK and translate it into worldwide momentum to tackle corruption. We need to make sure that we close down other safe havens as well as the UK.
Thanks. Does anybody have any questions on that? Yeah, Nick.
The figures for the 3 years in Chelsea and Westminster saw a reduction in terms of the annual amount of overseas property transactions. What's the reason for that?
It could be that the Chancellor did bring in some stamp duty changes. So he imposed he imposed a heavy stamp duty charge on offshore companies buying UK property, and he also imposed an annual tax on properties held within these corporate envelopes. But I mean, even on the most expensive properties, that can only go up to I think it's about 20,000 a year. So it's clearly a deterrent to, or it's an incentive not to use corporate wrappers for things like run-of-the-mill tax planning, inheritance tax avoidance, that kind of thing. It might be a factor in that sort of equation. But for your big-time money launderer, £20,000 a year probably isn't much of a bill. And if you notice the figures for the high end, those figures I showed for example, Knightsbridge, they showed that the number of offshore and the value of offshore purchases was actually going up in that period. Ewan.
Thank you very much, both. I'm currently acting as the executor for the estate of my late neighbour, and his beneficiaries are in really quite considerable distress because they not insignificant sums they expect to get from his estate are wiped out by the inheritance tax, and that is purely because of the Putin premium in the area we live in, Muswell Hill, which is no longer just Russians and Ukrainians, but very definitely and visibly obviously Central Asians. My question is, are there any discussions, are you putting anything in was done to the government on sort of plan Bs or plan Cs regarding either grabbing assets or securing income against them within the, as you pointed out, a very difficult framework of just go somewhere else? I say that because I don't want to put a spoiler on things, but while the James Glory case is a big step forward, we all know that took a huge amount of resources, and the case in relation to the assets, the case isn't finished. I mean, even standard is still reporting the legal battle goes on. So what about plan Bs and plan Cs, which is no easy?
I mean, it's a very good point. The James Abori case, I sort of joined this line of work about 18 months ago, and it's always cited as the success story, and it was 10 years ago. So it's clear that this problem, even when it's a successful case, is still to actually execute it and actually see the money return is really, really difficult. I mean, you've seen some examples, the Gaddafi mansion in Hampstead as well. I think the money there was successfully returned. It's really difficult, and it's more complex than just looking at the land registry or the property market. The area I work in is part of a broader campaign at Global Witness to look at things like resourcing for the police, to look at the suspicious activity reports mechanism and make sure that it actually works, that the timings that are required of police to actually do their investigations are reasonable. But the thing that I keep coming back to is without more resources, how are you actually going to see this through? And we're in a period in government where those resources are decreasing rather than increasing. And the issues that government's dealing with, especially around terrorism and the like, means that there are a lot of competing priorities. So do we have a plan B? Sort of. I mean, one of the things with the land registry requirements is potentially if you do get the rules in place and someone has failed, you could potentially seize that asset, and we will, as soon as those consultations start, we have some ideas around that already, but they're not easy solutions, and we would need advice from lawyers and the like to see it executed. So I think that's probably the closest we've got.
I think there's a huge problem with resources, and I think there's a lack of understanding in government about what this is really about. You will see today and tomorrow, Wednesday, the British government has a spending review which will divert loads more resources towards what it says is fighting terrorism. Money will be taken out of the police to do that. I'm not sure from this particular unit that we've been talking about, but there certainly is a lack of understanding that part of terrorism is the laundering all the money that funds it and sends the weapons everywhere. But that's quite long term and doesn't produce the short term headline. Yeah, sorry, gentleman at the back.
On your mat search, can you just look up company names as well? Was that on the search?
No, you can't, I'm afraid. We may be releasing the underlying data at some point, and then you'll be able to do that with the underlying data. We hope to do that fairly soon, yeah.
Did they produce that to you as data? And how much data was it? How difficult was it to get it? Is it the entire config?
Well, it's just England and Wales because of, going back as pre-union, Scotland has a separate legal system, and so we can't get Scottish land data. So it's just England and Wales. It looks like the data was released in error, that the land registry didn't mean to be so generous. And the official we dealt with is no longer there. And at the moment, I mentioned that data covers 2005 to 2014. We're trying to get more up-to-date data, which they're now resisting, which is ironic, really, because a big part of David Cameron's big anti-corruption drive was, openness, transparency, and this is the most basic information, really. But we would like to keep getting the data. Get it updated every 6 months or so that the database and that map is pretty up to date at any point. How many records? Well, there are 100 and something thousand. Yeah. Cynthia. Oh, that's a good idea, thank you. If and when we get to that stage, then, but that seems a long way off. I don't know, CHIDO may have a more optimistic view of it than I do, but our government seems to be saying to the overseas territories, the British overseas territories anyway. Oh, when they're... Yeah, I mean, I think that does get more complicated, and there may be some legal difficulties, because at the moment we're restricted to what is official information. I mean, actually, I should say that information does, and it's useful to know when you're using that map, it does contain some errors. They're not our errors, but they're the land registry's errors. There was one flat that we identified that sold between two Liechtenstein companies for £175 million, which looked slightly suspicious. I mean, it was a nice flat, but I put it to the people involved. It was a Syrian businessman called Raja Sidawi and his daughter, and I put it to them repeatedly that what's going on here? Surely this is some mistake, and they wouldn't reply. So we published it. And I don't know what happened then. Maybe they got a phone call from our friends at the yard. But they then got in touch and said, oh, no, there was a mistake there. It should have been 17.5 million, not 175 million. But I'm not sure I believe them. But anyway, so there are little errors in there.
Do you envisage that the UK will start using their proceeds of crime laws, regulations, rather than just the occasional fine for a couple of banks every 4 or 5 years?
What do you think?
I mean, yes, hopefully. There's been a recent movement to try and consolidate the different units working around, especially international issues of corruption. The reasons for that, at least that are given expressly, are to make it more efficient, to mean that actually you start seeing the laws being properly implemented, a sharing of information between different units. Other people might suggest that maybe it's been more of a sort of power or land grab by certain units in relation to others. I mean, if the unit does come together and it does get properly resourced, you could see, I think, the legislation being implemented in a more holistic way. But that remains to be seen. And it really does come down to resources, hiring the right people and giving them enough money to do the investigations.
Gentleman at the back.
Is it possible in any way to correlate the house purchase data with anything else, figure out where the money came from before it went to the particular offshore jurisdiction where it's bought?
To link the original source. We haven't done much on that, but it is something really worth looking at. And you do find there are trends. You can find, for example, that certain areas are popular among certain types of people. Oligarchs like certain squares. They like Eaton Square. They like certain other particular very small localities within London. And, of course, that gives you an idea where the money's come from. But no, we haven't done a lot on that. I mean, I'd be interested in any ideas, of course. Yeah.
Do you think there's any other or any countries which have got it right or more right than we have?
I mean, I don't know enough about everyone, but I would say no, based on the sort of interest from, activists in countries from the sort of developing and developed world and journalists. It sounds like it is a universal problem. The UK, at least, is leading the way in relation to company ownership in general. So you may see the UK performing better. I mean, you look at the US and the position's pretty dire in every strait, both on company ownership and on property ownership. Australia, it's a big issue, I think, as well, and there isn't even the same level of regulation that you see in the UK. So I would say not, but I don't know every jurisdiction.
I think we're worse, far worse, in the sense that we fail to appreciate the extra responsibility that the UK has because of just how attractive it is to dirty money, because the property market is so strong and is the ideal London property market in particular is the ideal place to put money. It's not the only one, but it's a very good one. People want to live here. It gives the advantage of being able to live here as well, educate children at schools that they seem to like. You know, there are a lot of reasons that the UK is particularly vulnerable, and that should be reflected in a tougher approach. But it seems to be, you know, quite the reverse seems to be the case. So.
I was just going to make the point that some jurisdictions seem to have actually gone back in terms of transparency, such as, for example, as I understand it, Switzerland, I know, having done some work on properties there, that at one point you were able to get names of individuals who were the owners of the properties, and there are restrictions in terms of the company ownership of properties in Switzerland to a certain extent. But that information is now not available anymore. So they've actually gone backwards.
Yeah, and when countries, there is a kind of, or there's seen to be a bit of a competition in the sense of, you know, ease of investment, ease of getting money in, which, you know, means that when countries do things like that, it seeps across to other countries as well.
You touched very briefly on the tension between the UK and the overseas dependencies, which are kind of, so on the one hand we have Cameron calling for more transparency, and on the other hand obviously we have the DUNN, etc., and wanting to preserve their anonymity. So interested to hear your thoughts on that dynamic.
I think it's a very ripe issue at the moment. There's a meeting next week, I think the 1st and the 2nd of December, of the Joint Ministerial Council on the Overseas Territories. And that's the sort of meeting where Westminster and the ministers for the overseas territories are supposed to get together and discuss their progress in relation to registers. The progress to date has not been great. I think more has been done in relation to tax than in relation to company secrecy and corruption. Cameron, in the same speech I referred to in my presentation, announced his intention to look into the property market, but he also announced his intention to host an anti-corruption summit, which is an international meeting of leaders from around the world to really try and tackle corruption in a global way. They're trying to progress that. It hasn't really taken shape yet. It's meant to be happening around summer in 2016, but it'll be a really interesting moment in relation to overseas territories because the entire world's going to be looking at him. And if he's there calling for transparency in the rest of the world, but his own backyard still is one of the worst secrecy jurisdictions in the world, it's going to be very difficult. So I think it creates a very interesting tension from a campaigning point of view, and I think we may see real movement, but at the same time recognising that 60% of the BVI's economy comes from company and corporation, so there's going to be a real pushback there. But I do think the next sort of 6 months are going to be very, very interesting in relation to that point.
Just on that point, you've already seen a flight from the BVI with the likes of HSBC thinking BVI is dodgy, so now you go to Seychelles. So okay, you close down precious dependencies, but there's plenty of other business to be done outside of there. So coming back to my first question to you, surely tackling the problem from inside, if you deal with the enablers here,
Yeah.
You're looking at 10, 15 years, another, you lose the pattern already.
We always say in relation to these sorts of problems, there just isn't one solution. Tackling the enablers is really, really important. It's a real focus of what we're doing. So the banks and the lawyers and the real estate agents. Lawyers really are, when you're looking at any of these deals, there is always a lawyer involved, and that lawyer is supposed to know the beneficial owner. Don't know if you know this, but when it comes to suspicious activity reports, a lawyer is entitled not to make a report if what they're dealing with is covered by legal privilege. And when you look at when that exception came into force, I think the number of SARs produced by lawyers dropped by, I think, 70 or 80%. It was a really, really... So they're really... I am an ex-lawyer myself, having worked in the city for 5 years, but they're really key to this problem. But, it's true. It's going to be... Any solution is going to be hard-fought. Implementing it's going to be difficult and expensive, and there will be more and more loopholes opening up around the world, but that's how this problem has to be dealt with. It just has to close down one loophole at a time.
Yeah, George.
At the risk of sounding naive and positing a simple solution after saying there wasn't a simple solution, isn't the simple solution just to say that non-resident companies can't buy property
kind of regulation that exists in places like Australia and Switzerland, where they have problems with large amounts of capital into their property markets?
I think you have a lot of problems there with discriminating against overseas companies. Not just under European law, that would be a big problem. Under other trade arrangements, it would be difficult. But I think you could very easily say that you just can't register UK property. You can't enforce the legal rights that come with it unless you were open about who the ultimate owner was, certainly.
But it's not exactly a solution at the same time, because there's a lot of dirty money in Australian property, even though you can't be a non-resident company owning that property. I mean, it will fix one part of the problem, but not the whole part. But interestingly, that's one of the solutions, sort of the legislative solutions that's being proposed, that in order to own property in the UK, you have to register with Companies House. And as a branch, you're subject to the same disclosure requirements as a UK company. So effectively levelling the playing field. If you want to own property here, you have to tell the government and the public the same things that you would if you're a UK company. And that's sort of what we're pushing for. But, I mean, again, we've only sort of started scratching the surface, but there are EU treaty issues with that. And whether or not it can be enforced is going to be a real legal battle for the UK to have. So it won't be easy.
Any more? One more here.
Do you think there are properties in the list that are owned by UK individuals with legal money that want to hide, just to hide their ownership for security or privacy?
Sorry, was the question whether there are UK individuals using offshore companies in there? Yeah, I mean, there certainly are.
Just to hide their ownership of the property.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and one of the things we looked at was we looked through freezing orders that had been obtained by various law enforcers in the courts, mostly criminal law enforcers, and there were, I think we found 70-odd, most of them involving UK citizens who had been hiding criminal proceeds through offshore companies. And if you look on this map, I mean, I focus very much on London and the southeast when I was showing you how it worked. But if you go to other areas of the country, you find, and so some of these areas where we found properties were frozen, it does appear that some of the criminal gangs in the north of England use property and hide that through offshore companies to hide their ill-gotten gains. Any more? That's it, I think.
Perfect. Only 5 minutes over.
I think we're just about on time. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.